In 2011. He's been involved in a number of different initiatives at the county. Maybe he'll talk about some non-public safety traffic stops, reimagining justice for youth, veterans court, sexual assault justice, promoting gun safety, combating sex trafficking, which I'll talk about today. I just want to say that I first met John in 2009, a long time ago now, when we were both on a board of a foundation that was providing chemical dependency treatment, and it was going to dissolve, and we had a very intense time trying to figure out how to disperse the funds to some other chemical dependency programs and then dissolve that long-time organization, and had fun walking with him in manager days many times during selections. John, I'm just going to leave it at that. He's on a number of different boards. He's received a number of different awards, but I want him to talk to you today. John Choi.
Thank you, Jackie, and good morning, everybody. First of all, before I begin my remarks, I just want to say thank you to all of you for the work that you do to make our Greater White Bear Lake community better. I was a former Rotarian. I was a member of Club 10, but I think what's happening here this morning and what you do, I think you meet probably on a monthly or weekly basis, but this type of engagement and connection with one another is so important. I think what we're losing in this country today is just the fact that we are just not connected, and we are divided in so many ways. But when we have community come together, where we have responsibility from a civic perspective that we need to give back, we need to participate, and also that we have the responsibility to connect with one another, I think is so important. So I just want to thank you for the dedication that you give to this Rotary Club. And of course, this Rotary Club has a great dedication to making our community better and living that four-way test. So this club, last time I was here, I can't remember when it was a while ago, but when I spoke here, I spoke on this topic, and back then, Rotary was just launching kind of their efforts to bring awareness to and do some good things around human trafficking. And I just want to thank the Rotary for all of your efforts to educate the public across the country, and of course here locally. So when I was first elected back in 2010, I took office in January of 2011. One of the first things that I wanted to work on, and this was not something that I just came up with on my own, but I think an important part of being an elected official and running for office is that you need to get out into the community and learn about things that you normally wouldn't learn about. And one thing that I learned about from people who worked with like runaway kids with homeless shelters is that there was sex trafficking happening in our community. That young, vulnerable people, especially teens, were being bought and sold, that there was this demand that would be creating this marketplace. And then there were people, bad people, who were the traffickers, who took advantage of this vulnerability and were actually exploiting and trafficking our kids. So if we could just go to the first slide. You know, the criminal justice system is a lot like an assembly line. We suffer from just a huge volume of work that's presented to us. As the prosecutor, our job is to respond to what the police, all these incidents that happened through 911, and police arrive and then they investigate if they think a crime has been committed and they present us a case for us to do something with, right? And oftentimes, then of course you've got a defense attorney, you've got a judge, you've got a corrections, all of those things. And it's just every day, it's just coming at you. There's bad things that happen in our community all the time. But what I have learned is that when we're talking about sexual violence, things that are kind of hidden, because we're a complaint-based system, the way that we operate is like you can't get on that assembly line unless you raise your hand and call 911, right? But what I found oftentimes that in these types of crimes, nobody is raising their hand. And in fact, we're not aware that these things are happening. And so when I first started talking about this issue, when I first got elected, a lot of police chiefs told me, they said, John, I don't think we have a problem in our community about human trafficking, sex trafficking, kids being exploited. Because we weren't necessarily seeing it, because nobody was necessarily raising their hand, right? So maybe if we just go to the next slide. So one of the things that I felt like what we needed to do is we needed to change our orientation about how we thought about this crime. And so we made an important announcement back in February of 2011. And what we said something really profound, which is that we said that we would no longer prosecute children who had been prostituted. Instead, we would treat them as children in need of protection and victims of crime. See, at that time, what was happening is that what the police would see when they came to a situation is that they would see a young person engaged in prostitution. And so oftentimes the person that got arrested was the teen. And they would end up in juvenile delinquency proceedings, and that was kind of it. We were going after the demand. We might have some stings at that time, but we weren't necessarily seeing how all of this would play out. Because again, this crime is about vulnerability, people who will look to find someone to expose that vulnerability, and then it's not like the movie Taken, where somebody gets kidnapped. It's not like Julia Roberts. Oftentimes, people will take advantage of that vulnerability, pose as a boyfriend, and then what happens is, if you really love me, then we got to start making some money. And so we started with this announcement that we would build out an approach where we would build services for these youth. At that time, there were only 2 shelter beds for runaway kids who had been sexually exploited or trafficked. Today in Minnesota, because of all the efforts that the legislature has made, we have more than 75 available beds. And there isn't a police chief in the state of Minnesota who would now tell me that, John, we don't have this problem, because we now realize that it's right in front of us. It's our kids that have run away from home. It's people that are exploited because of their immigration status, all of those things. And so this safe harbor approach, it was a really big deal. So we announced this back in February, but the legislature actually made that change in the summer in special session. Governor Dayton signed that into law. And then over the years, if we go to the next slide, actually we'll skip that just for the interest of time. But in Minnesota, on a bipartisan basis, and unlike many other states, we actually fund our safe harbor approach. And so over time, what has happened is that the state of Minnesota has now put into this type of work to have shelter beds, to have the appropriate responses, to actually treat these teens as victims. And we now go all the way up to age 24 to recognize that youth development goes up to the age of 24. But now we have those shelter beds, we have those responses, and through that victim-centered approach, our officers who are doing all of this work at the DCA and local police departments, they're gaining better trust with the victims. We are getting participation. Now we're at a point with our prosecutions that sometimes, it's very traumatic for a victim to have to testify and to explain what has happened to them, and oftentimes it doesn't really make sense, because oftentimes a juror might be thinking like, well, why don't you just leave? But with all the trauma and the manipulation, it doesn't work that way. But now we've come to places where there are prosecutions where we actually can prove a case without having to rely on the victim's testimony, because we've become so better at investigating, identifying these types of situations. And today, this type of crime is now normal. It's seen. We have a way in which we have advocates and community help those who have been trafficked and exploited. We have better conversations within our communities about the demand, right? And all of those things, I think, we have really built out, I think, a really strong public infrastructure to fight this type of crime. And a lot of it is because of the conversations that the Rotary has generated, and just all of it, we have much, much more awareness. If you just go to the next slide, I'm going to try to get through this really quickly. So obviously we've done a lot of training, and there's protocol development that we did, and I'm going to get to some of the, so I want to have some opportunity to talk about questions. So we can go to the next slide too. So this is where I'll in my remarks, I'm going to have Trey Ketwick, who's an assistant Ramsey County attorney, come up and talk about some of the cases that we've worked on. And kind of just to talk about the current status of the work in terms of where we're at as a state. Trey's assignment is to work on these cases, but also assigned specifically to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. So he's working with those agents on working on a lot of the details that they're working on. But this is target field, right? And we could fill it up 17 times over, and that would represent all of the women and girls in this state who have been a victim of some form of domestic violence, sexual harassment, assault, stalking. For 17 times, you can fill that up over and over, okay? But the vast, vast majority of those people who are the perpetrators are men. And I say that not to indict men, I'm a man, but really as an invitation for all of us to have the conversations about the demand. So as a part of our law enforcement strategy, we are now going after that demand. But also I know that it will never end unless we have the really critical conversations about how we raise boys into men, right? And that this is what men should be doing and not doing. So I think that's just a really important part of a prevention strategy that all of us in this room, because all of you have influence as fathers, uncles, grandparents, siblings. We just can't have better. I know it's hard to talk about these things. I have a 15-year-old boy, and just getting anything out of him and engaging him in conversation is hard. But I know that if I can model good behavior and good conversation and good thought with him, that he's going to make the world a better place for everybody that's around him. So maybe if we just go to the last slide. Oh, and there's my picture of my two kids, my boy and my daughter. They're much bigger now, they're 15 and 12. But I think the two, if they represent all boys and all girls in this country, there's something important about that if we can raise boys to be more loving and respectful. I know that my daughter will be growing up and representing this, that she will be valued and she will be safe. So I'm going to turn over to Trey, because I think the next slides are going to talk about the great work that is happening now. Because back then, just remember, people were thinking like this is not a problem. But today we've got the entire unit of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension focused on this. Local law enforcement knows how to investigate these cases, and it's really great to see this great progress. So Trey, if you could just take a few moments to go over your slides.
Absolutely, thank you, John. My name is Trey Ketwick. I'm with the Ramsey County Attorney's Office, and that's some of the work, some of the partnerships that John has helped facilitate, and right now the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. We have a created Minnesota Human Trafficking Task Force, and what that means is I am the attorney assigned to it to assist, but we are comprised of BCA agents, law enforcement members, and then we come together as a community in partnership with local law enforcement. So we have an officer and investigator from the Minneapolis Police Department, St. Paul Police Department, Ramsey County, Hennepin counties. We brought over Woodbury, Oakdale, and because we recognize that these cases aren't just occurring on an island. They're occurring in our community as a whole, and they're moving from place to place. People that are trafficking, generally young women, but also young men, aren't staying put in one location. So having this community partnership is helping us investigate these people, and that's part of what the task force is about. We also have people from Homeland Security, FBI, and we have these data analysts. And John talked about being able to prosecute some of these cases without bringing the victim back into court, putting her on the stand, and reliving that trauma. And what we have with these data analysts is we can go into these operations and find these women, and a lot of people, everybody carries a phone nowadays. And these are amazing treasure troves of evidence of what is going on in a person's life, what those communications are like, how they're being manipulated, how people are spending money or transferring money to people. Then we have data analysts who their job is to go through troves and troves of information and messages and online advertisements and connect phone numbers and emails with Johns, with the men, and generally men, who are buying sex. So we can knock on their door and say, hey, you were at the motel here with Rudy's Red Eye on January 13th. Do you want to talk about it? And we can get those statements and have that individual get up and sit on the stand and say, yes, I went into that room and I had sexual relations with a woman that I gave money. And that gives us that element of the offense instead of putting her on the stand. And it's a powerful piece, it's a powerful tool, but a lot of jurisdictions don't have that because law enforcement has, people that are on the street doing their work, and they don't have the ability to get into these cases and dig through these thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of messages and things like we do. Some of the work that we do for operation side, John talked a little bit about the demand side. We do some demand operations where we create a scene, create an advertisement as a young woman, and we wait for men to ask us if they can purchase us for sex. And it's amazing every time we do it. We do it for about usually 12 hours a day, sometimes longer. And the number usually, no matter what jurisdiction we're in, White Bear Lake, St. Paul, Pine City, Mankato, you'll get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men. Every single operation propositioning you for sex. Every time. Normally we do it as a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old, and we had an operation in St. Paul about a month ago where we had 10 men show up to have sex with a 16-year-old. It's remarkable. It blows my mind every time we do it. But those are the demand operations. And then we have recovery operations where we go on to these sex advertisements and we invite these young women, usually sex workers, to come to us. So we set up a staging area, and when they arrive, they're not treated as a prostitute. They're treated as a victim first and foremost, and we look for their needs. What do you need? Do you need housing? Do you need chemical dependency treatment? Do you need food, water, shelter? What do you need? And try to build a rapport, because a lot of times they won't talk to us right away, even if they're being trafficked, because the manipulation is so deep. Some of these women genuinely think they're in love, and that they would do anything to assist these people. And building rapport takes a long time. So we do those recovery operations and try to give them the services that John talked about, the safe harbor, the beds that are available, that if people can take advantage, that there is a place for them to go, so they don't have to go back to their trafficker. And then we also have the tip line. The tip line is goes straight to the task force, and we have data analysts and people who evaluate every single tip that comes in. If you think something is going wrong in your community, call the tip line and tell us about it. That's part of this community outreach piece. We go to the schools, we go into hotels, we go to the airport to talk to employees about what are signs to look for that something is amiss, that trafficking is going on, because it's happening throughout our community. The internet is an amazing place, but a dangerous place. The amount of grooming that goes on underneath, what we all believe. I have children, they're small children, fortunately, at this point, but the thought that they'll at some point have a phone, they'll have computer access, and they'll be speaking with people who I don't know about. And we don't always know what's going on. So looking for those signs and recognizing. If we can go to the next slide, I'll talk about just a couple of examples of practical, real-world things that are going on right now, cases that are actually charged. This is some of the groundwork that we do. It's kind of the scary portion of what's really happening in our community. Proactive operations. We have an individual named Julius Boston who's charged. He's currently at large, probably still trafficking women. And he's trying to, do I put my road? Flip my turn. He was been investigated since 2020. In the meantime, he went to prison, came back out, continued to traffic women. It's a proactive operation because one of the places that we finally caught him, at least a couple of times, or at least he worked and manipulated women through the internet and through giving them drugs. A lot of times these people prey on vulnerable women, people who have chemical dependency issues. And when you are the drug dealer and you can get that woman to confide in you, then you become their sole access for everything they need. And that's what he did. He provided the drugs and kept them close, and they couldn't leave him. And we were able to get evidence that he was doing it, because a lot of times he was very sneaky. He wouldn't be the one renting this hotel room. It would be one of the women. He wouldn't be the one that would take the women to the sex work. He would give somebody else money on the side and say, hey, I need you to drop her off. He would, or he'd use one of the other sex workers to drive people around. very, very sneaky. And back in the day, before we had these data analysts and before we had this community partnership, because he was doing this in Richfield, Bloomington, White Bear Lake, St. Paul, Minneapolis. Before we had this cooperation, a lot of times you would find the sex worker engaged in sex work, and that would be the person that would get in trouble. But we were able to take, through taking the cell phones, we recovered one of his victims at one of our operations. Went through her phone, and she finally opened up. She took advantage of some of the help. She's been back and forth between going back to the streets and coming back into safe harbor status, but she opened up and said, no, this is the guy, there's a guy that's trafficking me, here's the information. And we looked at it, we're able to tie his information to a lot of different sex ads, and he'd been picked up in 2021, and we interviewed more people from her phone that we located, and found out that he'd been doing it. We have him on at least 6 different victims. One of them was the mother of his children, who he was trafficking while she was pregnant, having somebody drive her to Wisconsin, and she had a bad fentanyl addiction, and he supplied her with the fentanyl. Unfortunately, she's a charged victim in our case, but she overdosed from fentanyl, from the trauma, the addiction, and you know, this is the person that's feeding on that weakness, and feeding on that vulnerability, and keeping her in a situation where, you know, we observed during these recovery proactive operations him at hotels and working on it, but he's the person that's charged currently for the sex work that went on in our community. Another one, community assistance, like I talked about, hotels, airlines, schools. We had a hotel that is actually right over by the White Bear hockey rink, where the state v. Larry Kona occurred. And Larry Kona is an individual who took a woman and exploited her from Georgia. She took her from Georgia, went to California, eventually made their way to Minnesota. And it's a gentleman who had her tattoo his name on her body in multiple places, branded her. She had a Larry under her eye tattooed. It was devastating. We had calls and videos of him beating her with a belt at a hotel in Roseville, but she wasn't in a position to say anything about it. So we had no evidence at the time. Clearly a woman in distress, but when she came over here to this hotel near the White Bear hockey rink, she finally had enough, and as she was walking out, she threw a note to the hotel clerk, and she got the note. She said, "I am being trafficked. Please help me. Please help me." And law enforcement responded. They grabbed Larry, and they put him into custody. They interviewed her, and she eventually provided an interview of what was going on, and we had a cell phone, and we had corroborative evidence of what she said. But she wanted nothing to do with Minnesota. She's not from here. She fled. She left to California. And we helped with assistance of getting the tattoo removed, starting to go through that process. But when it came to trial time, she didn't want to come back here. She didn't want to ever see Larry again. So it became incumbent upon our team to say, how can we find evidence that he did this, that we can present, that doesn't involve re-traumatizing this woman? And fortunately, he made some unfortunate admissions that kind of said, well, you know, I took some money here and there, and we have pretty good laws here in the state of Minnesota, partially because of the work that John has done and people that are supportive of this, that we don't have to prove some things that other jurisdictions do, mainly force, fraud, or coercion. Now, simply taking money and prostituting somebody, receiving those profits is enough. And so Larry had made a couple of admissions, but we had a lot of corroborative evidence. And Larry went back onto Instagram. Like I said, these people are not always the smartest. They always, a lot of times, in that manipulative, you know, thinking that they are the king of their domain, their books on, they think they're the pimp. Went on Instagram and continued to flaunt his lifestyle. And actually continued, he went down to Rochester, where he's from, and while we were pending sentencing, he found 2 more victims and was selling the victims on advertisements as well. And one of those victims ran away. And fortunately, right before our sentencing, she came to law enforcement, we talked to her, we had the Instagram documentation, we had sex advertisements from Larry's phone number, and he was actually in one of the advertisements where he was selling one of the women, and the judge saw it prior to our sentencing, and Larry had no prior criminal history. He thought he was gonna go there and nothing was gonna happen, and the judge sent him to prison, which is where Larry belongs. So now he's being prosecuted out of Rochester. The tip line is the last one I'll talk about before I guess quickly. The tip line, we got a tip the other day, a few months back, about a missing woman. And a lot of these people are weak, vulnerable, people who are addicted to drugs. And the BCA investigator said, something's amiss, and she went after and looked into the information about this woman. About a week into it, she got all the videos from this woman's apartment building, and she said, something's wrong. I think she's dead. And we're not the homicide unit, but this came to us as a missing person. This was a former sex worker. And she dug into it, and we looked at the video and said, yeah, I think you're right. But it wasn't a homicide, there was no body. And she looked into it, and got partners, and they went through and walked fields, and still nothing. And eventually, went through and looked at this gentleman who had been walking in and out of her apartment building on video 28 times, carrying bags out, carrying cleaning supplies into the room. We eventually got a search warrant, found a large amount of blood in the hotel, or in the apartment room, and got other partners on board saying, okay, we're gonna investigate this as a homicide. And unfortunately, we found that young woman chopped up into pieces. I don't know if people have seen this in the news. And she was placed and wrapped in saran wrap and placed in the duffel bags and hidden in a storage closet. One of the things that our task force is able to do with that tip line is we had the investigator poured so many hours into finding this person who this guy thought that he could just kill and nobody would care about. She was a missing person. She was a drug addict. Well, 2 years prior, he'd done the same thing. There was another missing woman that came through our tip line. Previously, we looked forward, another tip came through right around the same time we were investigating, and his name came up again. And she followed and followed and followed after we found that first person. And this woman who was a previous sex worker who went missing over 2 years ago, we found her also chopped up. And she was in a storage closet in a different community, in a cooler. It's horrifying, horrifying stuff, but the tip line helps. That person is charged with the atrocities that he's committed. And despite him thinking that, you know, he can take advantage of these women who are weak and vulnerable, we've got him. Now he's gonna hopefully spend the rest of his life behind bars. So that's some of the work that some of the practice started to scare people about what's going on in the community, but it's the real life work that we're doing. So I'll turn it back for questions.
So I think we're at 8:18, so we got a little time, so.
Does anybody have questions to ask these two?
Thank you, gentlemen, for the presentation this morning. I was talking with one of my employees the other day. He lived in southern Minnesota in a small community along Highway 90, and he was telling me about the trafficking that goes on. Make people aware of stuff like that. It happens out of state. These children are trafficked to other states and stuff like that. Is it worse in a particular area in the state, or is it worse in the in the metropolitan area?
I think that trafficking is really a product of the demand. And demand is everywhere in America. And that's the conversation that I'm encouraging people to have as we think about our own culture, that somehow that it's okay for men to create this demand, right? So people say that, you know, Minnesota might be the 13th largest place where trafficking occurs. Well, we're probably the 13th largest state. So it's just commensurate with whatever kind of the demand, where there's demand. So like for instance, Interstate 90, and I think it intersects with 35, if I'm not mistaken, down in Albert Lee. But communities can do something about it. So there's an organization called Trekkers Against Trafficking. And so they work with truck stops, because this is where some of that demand is where it exists, right? So they're working on creating awareness so that if there are victims who are in the bathroom, they get connected to the tip line or the 1-800 number through Polaris Project. And they're also educating the people that work at these truck stops to identify young people who are vulnerable, who might be being exploited and or trafficked. So I think it's just a product of, like, and Trey talked about this, honest to God, I mean, if I took that computer and I put up get on the internet and put up an ad that would seem kind of enticing, and put a photo up of just a young model, the phone would ring within like a minute or two. And if I was a BCA agent sitting at that computer looking at the ad, or the people that are calling on the ad, I mean, the phone would just be ringing all day long. That's the type of demand that leads to this type of exploitation and trafficking and the death and all these horrible things that human beings should never ever be subjected to, right? Human beings are not property, and we should, as a civilized society, we should never create those conditions. But again, it's that marketplace that creates these bad things, and this marketplace is all over America. And that's just something that we're gonna have to wrestle with if we ever want to change that. Trey, you need to add to that?
No, I think you're right.
Yes, I hope it works. So you talked about raising good boys, and I think about our kids in school right now, and I think about the phone and the social media apps that they use. Do you have any comments about like TikTok, or what parents are to do to even these beautiful young girls that are 14 that look like they're 24? How do parents help?
Well, as a parent, I don't always know the answer. I think it's hard. We have spent a lot of time in this state talking about early childhood family education and the recognition that if we can help parents be good parents when their kids are young and get kids connected to preschool, that's going to have a huge impact on their positive formation in development. I also think that just parents, like from a community perspective, we all need help too about how to have these hard conversations, working with our own kids, having these conversations, but it's so critical that we have them. And I think schools are a really important place where, if you think about it, there are positive role models there, there are sex education that would be happening in schools. But I think also too, in these environments, it's a good place also to really engage some kids. So if we could just go back, I skipped over this other, thank you, right there. So there's a lot of great work that's happening around, so the one thing that I wanted to call out is there's a group called Men as Peacemakers. It's based out of Duluth, but now they've got this huge footprint all across the country, but they're being hired by school districts and communities to give trainings, like for instance to coaches, because I remember growing up, I went to an all-male Catholic military high school, and I remember there was a Spanish teacher that was hired. She was a younger female, and I remember it's just something that just always stuck with me. But she was walking across the cafeteria, and some of the boys were whistling, and they were doing something very inappropriate, right? And it's just like, at that time I was in 9th grade, people thought it was kind of funny, but there was a teacher there, and he thought it was funny too. And so, but that moment, right there, at that moment, today I could look back on that and say that was so wrong. But at that time, that was a great opportunity for that interruption and to model some different type of behavior that's inappropriate. Think about the conversations that happen in locker rooms, and so coaches, I think, have enormous influence about that conversation. We should also be talking about what we can do to have better conversation with our girls, so that they understand and recognize that their value is not wrapped around their physical appearance, that it's more about their self-esteem, to build up self-esteem, and all of those things. Those conversations, I think, are really critical. These are things that we don't think about often because they're so embedded in our culture. You just turn on the TV and it's put right into your face. We don't even realize that these messages are being told to our young girls, that your value is maybe based upon how you look, and that how boys should be thinking about gender-based relationships, all of those things. But there are organizations out there. I think all of you, as owners of our school district, and we have our superintendent here, but making sure that we have healthy conversations in our schools, right? That's a good thing, because it's hard at home to have those conversations, because we're all busy. But we want to make sure that these positive things are happening in athletics and in our schools, in our community. And you have a big role to play in all of that. I really do. I think if we want to change some of these things, that the bad things that happen in our community, we need to confront some of the hard things that we have to do in our lives. And one of which is just the conversations and the relationships that we have within our families, our communities, our places of worship, and where we all congregate. And it's great that here in this Rotary Club, you guys are talking about these things and thinking about it.
Any other questions? We just have a couple minutes.
When you're out and about in a public place, is there something we could be looking for to help identify something? You know, we're out walking on the street, or we're at a restaurant or someplace.
Yeah, some of this is stuff that makes you just feel uncomfortable in general. You know, you see, usually it's a young woman, but also young men as well. People who look like, it might look like a domestic situation, somebody who looks timid, somebody who looks like they're being controlled. Usually it's men using abusive language, or somebody that looks like they're in just a dominant position. Sometimes when those women are able to get away, what we talk to like airline flight attendants and some hotel employees, when they have that moment, just being able to say, are you okay? Just giving that opportunity to say, you know, give them the ability to show that somebody else is there that potentially cares for them. Because a lot of times they feel like they're on an island with their trafficker, and that person is in complete control. And giving them a little bit of control to be able to open-ended question, hey, are you okay? Sometimes it's not always easy, but if you see something that doesn't look right, it doesn't hurt to bring it up and ask somebody else. Ask if you're at a restaurant, ask the waitress, hey, you know, you're dealing with that table. Does something seem off with that relationship? Is it just me, or is something off? Because usually you're not the only one that's probably noticing it. But a lot of times, you know, we don't want to get in other people's business, and that's hard to reach that level. But all it takes is asking somebody, are you okay? Do you need help? Can I do something? And it can, a lot of times people will say no, because they don't want to get hurt. There's a cycle of violence. But there are absolutely times when reaching out will help, and will help that one individual. And that's a big thing.
Well, thank you both for being here today. It's a very heavy topic, but the work you're doing for the community and the state and the world as a whole is wonderful. John, you've already received a bear before, so now it's your turn to receive our white bear. Thanks for being here today. I missed one thing before our program started, but our exchange student has prepared an update for today, so I wanted to give him at least